This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
This event and other events like it, and the real kind of impetus behind it is kind of to bring us together as a group and to facilitate discussion on issues that are relevant to us and locally, and also us as a field more broadly. And so in the spirit of that, we wanted the first one of these Friday afternoon sessions not to be just someone standing up here and talking at you for 50 minutes, but something that's a little bit more interactive and engaging, and hopefully something that we can all get something out of. And so we've decided to host a panel discussion on improving psychological science, which was kind of born out of a similar session that we hosted in semester one. And what came out of that, which was this broad question of is psychological science in crisis, was a real desire for people to see kind of concrete solutions or things that they could do in order to address these kinds of issues. So putting aside the question of whether there is a crisis or whether we should call it a crisis, what are some concrete strategies that we can implement in order to make the work that we do just that little bit better? And because I like to challenge people unnecessarily, I've asked our crack team of panellists to take the time to think about what would be the one thing that they would recommend someone do if they were going to do one thing to improve their science. And so each of our panellists here are going to speak for around about 5 to 10 minutes, preferably on the shorter side, so that we can have a broad discussion about the things that have come up, debate about what are the best things that we can do, but also just general sharing of information about where we can get access to information about the things that we really want to learn about in order to improve the next research project that we produce. I encourage you to tweet this event if you're so inclined. This is our handle if you want to do that. Without further ado, I'll introduce our first panel member, who is Fiona Fidler. She's really well placed to talk about these issues. In addition to doing a PhD on the philosophy of science, she's now an ARC Future Fellow on issues pertaining to open science. So I'm really interested to hear what she has to say. Please take it away, Fiona.
Thanks, Katie. So ordinarily in situations like this, by which I mean scenarios where people say, what's the one thing that you could do to save the world or take with you on a desert island or whatever, so what's the one thing you could do to save science? I've kind of had this natural inclination towards the very dramatic high road, like ban null hypothesis testing forever. But I've really worked through a lot today to resist that urge. And instead I'm doing the complete opposite. So I'm going for the lowest possible hanging fruit, absolute least effort, minimal solution. This is a lazy Friday afternoon scientific revolution that I'm talking about today. And in line with those sentiments, the proposal, the one thing that I'm going to propose today is completely stolen from someone else. This is actually Joe Simmons and Leif Nelson's proposal. It's the 21-word solution to all of our problems with reproducibility and replicability in psychology and other disciplines. So I'll get to exactly what those 21 words are eventually, but in brief, the proposal is simply this, that in any article that you write in which you did not p-hack your results or cherry-pick the outcomes or hark your way towards a perfect narrative, you should say that. You should say, I did not p-hack these results. I did not exclude outliers to make my results statistically significant, and so on. I did plan my power and I did plan my sample size using formal techniques. I didn't just keep going till I hit significance. So they've got various 21-word statements that say these kinds of things really kind of succinctly and nicely, and the idea is, you know, to create an expectation in the literature that this is what you will read, that you should be looking for a statement like that, and when you don't find it, then, you know, you might be suspicious or apply extra scrutiny. So why do any of us think that such a solution might be necessary? This is a 21-word solution to what exactly? You will have probably, if you're here and interested enough to come to a session like this, have heard about questionable research practices, and there's growing evidence, some of which I'll show you in a minute, that these practices are very common, not just in psychology, but in other places too. So typically the set that we worry about includes p-hacking, which is stuff like checking the statistical significance of the results before you go on and collect more data. So if you've got p less than 0.05 with 20 people, great, you just stop. If you haven't, you keep going, get another 10. Various other things in that category. And cherry-picking results mean you might have run 12 conditions, but only 5 of them turn out to be statistically significant, so you only report those, and you make no mention of the others. And HARKing, so presenting some kind of post hoc thing that you did as exploratory work as though it was predicted all along. So you present it as though it was your a priori hypothesis that just sort of worked out perfectly. So there have been a few surveys trying to estimate the prevalence of how common these sorts of practices are. The first one was done, they're a bit out of order. So the first one is actually in the second column. It was done by Leslie John and her colleagues. So we can see that for some of these things like cherry picking, not reporting all of the outcome variables that failed to reach statistical significance, about 2/3 of people in the original survey had done that. There was a replication of that survey done by Franca Agnoli with Italian psychologists, and the rates the rates of these QRPs seem to cross cultures. This is not a specific US problem. And as you can see in the last 2 columns, it's also not a specific psychology problem. Hannah Fraser, here in the green jacket down the front, has led this study of ecologists and evolutionary biologists documenting how widespread these practices are in those disciplines too. And the rates of p-hacking and cherry picking are pretty surprisingly close in all of these fields. So this is partly what the 21-word solution is about. So you might think that, it's a problem in itself, of course, that these rates are so high, and you might think the best thing we could do for the discipline would be to just stop engaging in these practices, but that doesn't fit with the kind of lazy Friday scientific revolution I'm talking about. That's in the too hard basket. The problem I'm worried about today is just how we identify these things. It's actually very hard for the casual reader of the literature to be able to tell whether the results that they're reading have been p-hacked. Now, there are some self-identified data thugs out there in the Society for Improving Psychological Science community who will trawl through the data of published papers and do have techniques for detecting various kinds of p-hacking. But there's only very few of those people, and the chances of them providing a comprehensive evaluation of all the literature is pretty low. There are also some recent efforts, strangely spearheaded by the US Department of Defence, about developing automated tools for detecting these sorts of problems, or improving experts' ability to be able to detect when questionable research practices have been used. But again, even if those things pull off, they might help us with kind of sorting through our existing literature. But surely a more sustainable practice for the future is for us to self-identify. So to include things like a 21-word statement when we haven't done these practices, which will at least let us be able to sort of locate our efforts to the rest of the literature. So to this end, I think the one thing that you can and should do to help scientific reform efforts is this, is to include 21-word statements like this one. So if you did determine how to calculate your sample size beforehand, if you didn't p-hack your way to that sample size, then simply say, we report how we determined our sample size, all the data we excluded, if any, all manipulations, all measures in the study. This is a signal that you haven't p-hacked or cherry-picked your results. They also, in this article, give a little bit of advice about what you might add to that if it's not quite true. So if you did, for example, add 50 observations after analysing the first 100, you could add a statement like that in as well. So this just gives us a little bit more gives us readers and consumers of the literature a little bit more insight into how the results were developed. This picture is also stolen from the Simmons paper. So really what this is a call for is just to apply to the scientific literature the same standards we apply to food labelling, for example. So to say how many measures you dropped, how many conditions you dropped, how many observations you dropped. And so that's my one thing. Include a 21-word statement. If you haven't p-hacked, if you haven't cherry-picked, say so. Create a new scientific norm. Thanks.
Was there any very brief clarification questions or anything for Fiona before we move on? No, everyone's on board. Great. So our next panellist is doing his PhD on issues related to open science. He's actually fresh from the Society for Improvement in Psychological Science, so it's our very own data thug, Felix Singleton Thorn.
Alrighty, so I am going to step up the level of difficulty. This is getting beyond the kind of Friday afternoon, and maybe we're into Monday mornings. Hopefully not too much. But I'm going to be talking about pre-registration. I think that if we can do one thing as individuals to improve our scientific research, it is pre-register our studies, pre-register everything we do. For those of you who don't know, pre-registration is just putting your research plans in a time-stamped and publicly accessible repository before you do any data analysis, usually before data collection as well. Pre-registration just includes the hypotheses or research questions you're going to be exploring, your data collection methods, your variables, whichever variables you're going to be collecting, all of them, and your statistical models or tests, as well as any decision criteria that you're going to have. So that sounds like quite a lot of information to put in. Why is this a good thing? Why is it a good thing to have this open and accessible to everyone? First off, it places a record for other people to know what you're doing, which is always good. Small benefit, but it's nice. People can know the studies that you haven't published yet. It allows us to remember when we come back after 6 months, data collection takes a while, we've forgotten what our main hypotheses were. Maybe they've changed a little bit over time as you've seen the data come in, things like that, which is nice. And it also reminds you what statistical tests you're planning on using. But I think the most important thing that pre-registration gives us is it gives us the ability to distinguish between data-dependent and data-independent analyses. This is a really important idea, but I don't think it's entirely intuitive. And I think that the history of psychological research suggests that it's entirely unintuitive, especially to those people who've had a statistical education. So p-values, confidence intervals, along with fit statistics and Bayes factors, etc., although their story is a little bit more complicated, but p-values and CIs definitely lose their interpretability if we perform data-dependent analyses, or if we perform multiple analyses and selectively report results. So the kinds of data-dependent decisions that I'm talking about, those things that we often leave these kinds of things, these kinds of decisions to the point where we're actually doing the analysis, right? So often we've got some plan for our study. We have some idea we're going to use an ANOVA of some sort. We don't really nail down the specifics until we get to the point where we're actually doing the data analysis. And these kinds of things can be as large as, like, which of these measures of aggression was the primary outcome? Which baseline measures are we going to control for? We've collected gender information. Should we include it in our model or not? Do we need more participants? For whatever reason, should we exclude certain participants? Are we interested in including an interaction effect in our statistical model? All of these things impact the p-values or whatever outcome measure we're going to use. And we know as psychologists that we have biases, right? We're all inclined to actually find exciting results. We have there's a really strong institutional pressure for us to produce a lot of interesting results, interesting findings. The idea that those pressures wouldn't influence the way that we're going to make these minor decisions, I think as psychologists should seem at least counterintuitive. The question of how much it matters is kind of a separate issue. So maybe these things bias us and it doesn't make any difference in the end. Like the p-value is going to be fine in the end. The results will be more or less the same. But I think that there's really compelling evidence that in fact we can push our type 1 error rates, our false positive rates, well beyond any reasonable level that we'd call acceptable. So just by combining these different kind of normal decisions in a biased way, we can get error rates that are as high as 30 pretty plausibly. I mean, in kind of extreme scenarios, you can get error rates as high as 60% when the null hypothesis is entirely true. And these are not, this isn't like making up results. This is just making those decisions in a heavily biased way. So there are some common objections to this proposal that I think it's worth addressing, at least briefly. So one of these objections is like, what about creativity? Why do we have to pre-register everything? And I'm not arguing against exploratory analysis. Exploratory analysis is probably the majority of what we do as psychologists. The problem is that we present it in our papers as if it is confirmatory. Every paper looks like a confirmatory analysis has been performed. Maybe not every, but the great majority. And a lot of these things are kind of blurry, right? We have some idea of what we're testing for, but the exact details are not figured out. Another common objection is, what happens if I pre-register a test and its assumptions are broken? This is a statistical concern. You're planning a t-test, but you've got a bimodal distribution in your data. I mean, this is one important thing to know about this kind of movement, is no one is actually puritanical. Like, the thing that you do in that case is you say, I pre-registered a t-test, and it turned out the data was bimodal, so I'm not going to do a t-test. And you just write that in your paper, and no one's going to attack you over it. You're not like breaking the rules of pre-registration. Finally, I think a reasonable concern is what happens, exactly, yeah. What happens if I pre-register a stupid? What happens if I pre-register something and it's just horrifically embarrassing? God knows that we've all done something, like late at night, we're writing the thing, we put it up on the internet, and then you're like, oh God, and now you can't delete it. It's fine. It was a scientific mistake. Our lab was looking at doing a study of the concordance between pre-registration and the published papers. This is the idea of looking at how closely aligned pre-registrations were with, and the main thing I think that I saw, or the most heartening thing that I saw, was someone who'd made a horrible mistake in their pre-registration. They pre-registered a bunch of stuff and they were like, in the paper, they were like, and then we thought about it and it turned out it was a very bad idea and this analysis doesn't make sense. And they wrote this in this paper. And I think the main thing is not that they wrote it in the paper. The main thing is they totally acknowledge what they'd done. And reading that in a paper didn't make me like dismiss their results. I wasn't like, oh, well, they're an idiot. We as scientists make a bunch of mistakes all the time, and we're also mostly reasonable human beings. Reading that, I was like, this person is amazing. I want them to be the leader of everything. And I trusted their paper a lot more after reading that. All right. So that's it. My one solution is pre-register your studies. Just do it. It's really not that hard. You can do it as individuals. It helps you distinguish between the two. Thank you.
Our final panelist is Piers Howe, who is an associate professor in the school here. And I asked Piers to be on this panel because I know he reads and thinks really deeply about these issues, but I think more importantly for this kind of situation, he also has a lot of opinions. So, yes.
I'm really not sure that was a compliment. Yes, I have opinions, and occasionally I make comments on other people's papers about such things. Look, the one thing that I would argue for is that we as individuals and we as a field should be attempting to replicate other results in the field much more than we actually are doing so. And if we're to do this, a lot of these problems would go away naturally, and even if these problems were to go away, we would still need to do a whole lot of replication. So that's what I'm going to be arguing. But it being Friday afternoon, evening, I'm going to start off in a slightly light-hearted vein and a flight of fancy. Suppose you think ahead to the future and you've had your illustrious academic career, you've worked hard, you've become very highly respected by all your colleagues, you've worked your way up the ladder, and now you've got that job you've really, really wanted to get. You have become editor-in-chief of your favorite journal, the International Journal of Treasure Hunters. So, and you are trying to compile the first submission, and you have to, and you've only got space for one more article in that edition, and you've got two articles to choose from, and neither of them have done any questionable research practices. Both are pre-registered. The reviewers were very positive about both, but they're giving different messages, and so you're going to choose which one to take based on the message. And I'm going to argue that this will demonstrate a publication bias which you and the entire field have shared. So the first article, really, the crucial data comes down to one diagram. And remember, this is the International Journal of Treasure Hunters. This article, with a whole lot of scientific evidence to back this up, which I'm not going to bother showing you here, says there is treasure at location X. That's pretty much the gist of the article. The other one, which you're considering for publication, says there is no treasure at location X. It's reporting a null finding, a very well supported null finding, perhaps even done in a Bayesian fashion. We are highly confident that there's no treasure at location X. There are pictures of them digging a big hole. There's nothing there, guaranteed. Probably the only thing the whole field could agree about. So, you only have space for one of these articles. Turns out your buddies actually were the authors of this article. But I wonder, which article would you publish? Now, I'm guessing most of you would publish the article with this finding and not that finding. So there's a little bit of a publication bias. You like articles that tell you what something is. Journals share the same publication bias as you. They like to publish findings that are statistically significant, and preferably with large effect sizes. Null results have a harder job of being published. Smaller effect sizes have a harder job of being published. Now, there would be nothing wrong with this publication bias if all journal articles were 100% reliable. But even if you don't engage in any questionable research practices, even if you engage with Bayesian analyses and dismiss all that null hypothesis testing, even if you pre-register everything, and pre-register your pre-registrations, no, I'm kidding, but if you do everything absolutely correct, it's a stochastic process. There's noise. So sometimes you're going to get errors. Your estimates of effect sizes will almost never be exactly correct. Sometimes they'll be a bit too small, sometimes they'll be a bit too large. Sometimes they'll be so far off that you will make false positives as well as misses. Okay, the problem is that because of these errors, which you will never escape because of the stochastic nature of experiments, this publication bias will tend to make the field even when done perfectly, unrepresentative. Errors that inflate effect sizes, errors that result in you finding significance when there is none, errors that result in false positives, are more likely to be propagated in the field than the converse, so your field will become somewhat unrepresentative of reality. You will think you know, the field will think it knows more about what's going on than it really does. You will think you know more about where the buried treasure is than you really do. So what can we do about this? Pre-registration helps, it reduces the problem. Avoiding questionable research practices help. But what you really need is you need people actually trying to replicate studies. You need people actually going and digging at that spot to see if there's treasure. And you don't need just one person, you need multiple people. So you can get multiple studies, and so you can compare the effect sizes. So I'm calling for multiple direct replications. And I would argue that the one thing we can do as individuals and as a field is any time that we regularly perform these direct replications, and we especially do so any time we're moving into a new area. And I think this is especially relevant to PhD students, especially new PhD students. You've read the literature, you think you've got this really cool idea you want to test, but it's probably based on one or two key papers or maybe one key finding. Before you test your great, fabulous, earth-shattering prediction, replicate the key finding. And also, don't just replicate it, publish it. Of course, publishing these things is easier said than done. Journals, as I said, don't like to publish replications. A survey conducted by Martin and Clark in 2015 found that only 3% of psychology journals actually explicitly said they would consider publishing replications. This number has increased slightly since then, but generally it's hard to publish a replication. And the problem is, with a replication, two things happen. Either you do replicate the finding, in which case, where's the novelty, or you don't replicate the finding, in which case you now have a null finding. Cynical but true. Well, no, if it's true, it's not cynical. But what this misses is that there actually are journals out there who are willing to publish findings if they're methodologically sound, and of course these would of course be pre-registered studies without any unquestionable research practices. They will publish whatever, providing it's methodologically sound, without regard to whether they perceive them to be significant. Things like PLOS ONE, Frontiers, and Piaget. And even other more mainstream journals will publish if you contact the editor in advance and explain why you feel the replication attempt is warranted. You can often negotiate an in-principle acceptance of your article in advance. That's not always advertised on their websites, but I've known plenty of editors do this, but only for what they consider the really crucial findings in the field. So it is possible. A lot of the barriers that we think would prevent us as a field from doing it aren't actually there. It is possible to publish replication attempts. And I think this is the one thing we should all be doing much more. I also think there's things that the field could do to encourage these replication attempts further, and that is what my commentary with Amy Pafors was on this article was all about, what the field could actually do. But I probably had my 5 minutes, so I will stop there.
All right, so we've had 3 suggestions, including information on the 21-word solution, pre-registering your research, and replication. So we've gone all the way from Friday afternoon through Monday morning through to presumably somewhere midweek. I certainly have a few questions for our panellists, but I'm sure you do as well. Would anyone like to start us off with a question? Mike.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So, So at the Journal of Business Ethics, we've got a call for papers for pre-registration, because there's a fair amount of kind of traditional, straightforward, positivist and critical work that gets moved there. But what we've also got for a special issue is a second track, which is devoted to kind of critical examinations of what this is kind of all about, where it came from, what are its core features, these concerns over whether it's replicability or the foundations of various kinds of scientific practices in social psychology and beyond. And one of the reasons why we did that is because what we think is one of the features of what's happening here, at least it seems to us, is that there is kind of the core of how people understand whether or not scientific practices are good, the logic of statistics and probability. And that involves, obviously, kind of a model-based understanding of the world. You're there to get the model right? And you're there to, as if hypotheses were kind of de facto true or false. The world comes prepackaged as kind of functioning through this logic of statistics and probability, right? So as long as you get the model right, then your hypotheses will be true, and you can deal with uncertainty with probability theory, et cetera, et cetera. But that seems quite myopic. Like, what a strange place to start, right? That the underlying logic which kind of creates the problem, oh, we've got too many type 1 errors, well, who says that that's the right way to do science at all? Why start with that? And then when you run into problems as a function of the logic that you're deploying, go back to the logic itself to understand how to fix your practices. Why not say, the problems that we see arise as a function of the logic that we deploy, which is based on statistics and probability, notions of type 1 and type 2 error, and then, right, and that's why we get a laugh out of, then you just go Bayes or something, right? Why is that funny? That's funny because otherwise you're a frequentist, and actually, we don't know how to do things in ways that aren't really dealing with uncertainty in probabilistic terms. So if the logic that we use is kind of creating our own understandings for how we're getting things right and wrong, is there another way? And I think that that's what, too often, people who have who offer commentaries on whether it's reproducibility or whatever, this problem that's all of a sudden emerged, even though everybody knew all along there was a bunch of bullshit going on. Obviously, if you're brought up in the Department of Psychology, you knew that. You're training in social psychology. But what if the problem is different? And instead of starting with statistics and probability, we say, well, what's the purpose of science? And if the purpose of science is doing something practically useful, then why begin as if the world came prepackaged in model-based ways and hypotheses could be true or false, and we should act in relation to those things and govern ourselves in relation to those things? Why not instead say, well, how can we be practically useful? What tools and logics can we deploy in order to be kind of pragmatic, right? And then all of a sudden, this game that everyone's playing with type 1 or type 2 errors and reproducibility, as if that made something useful, kind of evaporates, and what you're left with is more basic and fundamental questions that we at the Journal, this is partly advertisement, we at the Journal of Business Ethics are going to entertain in an upcoming special issue, call for papers. You can submit papers to that if you're interested in these topics. But what do you all think about that, right? That actually there are substantially more fundamental concerns, and you've kind of showed up to the party late, or taken as fact the terms on which the problem is being understood, as opposed to critically analyzing those as well, including their historical and social institutional context and development.
I'd like everyone to thank our fourth panel member, Mike Zephyr. Responses?
Yeah, so I think, well, if I can kind of paraphrase that as an argument that I've been pushing too, you can tell me if you think it's the same sort of thing. So I reckon part of the problem that we have here is that all of the solutions that have, well, this is not quite fair. Most of the solutions that have been offered by advocates of reproducibility or the open science movement are about fixing the hypothetico-deductive method.
Right.
So they're about fixing science that is about hypothesis testing, whether that's frequentist hypothesis testing or Bayesian hypothesis testing or whatever. But if we look at the history and philosophy of science, it tells us that those hypothetico-deductive activities actually only constitute a very small part of what we do. Now, you wouldn't know that from reading the literature because we've all sort of forced every exploratory, abductive thing that we do into that model, which has created the QRPs. You know, HARKing and cherry picking and all of that kind of stuff are sort of a product, if you like, of trying to squish other types of scientific reasoning into that hypothetico-deductive model. And if we sort of, you know, if we see, there's one way in which we could see this kind of crisis or episode or whatever you want to call it as an opportunity to make some more space, to legitimise the rest of those activities, to make exploratory research okay, or to talk about abductive reasoning, not just hypothetico-deductive reasoning. So far that hasn't happened, but I really agree that it should.
Arguably, the opposite has happened, which is now everyone's got to be policed, in more serious terms, and I mean, it's
so far, but I think it's not finished yet. We're not at the end of it yet.
Question from Brock.
I mean, some of that was also aimed to like who's asking the question, right? But so it could be, there's a whole lot of stuff in that. But there's also, is the question even a good one in the first place? So, you can have an absolute dimwit register an experiment with a really stupid hypothesis, which turns out to be wrong.
Yeah.
Does that place any more weight on finding a confirmatory finding because the dimwit put the finding there on the internet? Or you could have somebody who, for example, put a prediction up and refuses to give up on it in the face of the data because they're committed to their theory. So one of the things that I think is missing in all of this is who's asking the questions? Are they good questions to ask? And what are the methods for going back into the theory or going back into the literature? Because we often do that. We look at our data and go, hang on a second, I knew this body of work, body of work A, and all of a sudden I've come across body of work B, which is so much better than A. Don't know why I didn't know about B. As if I had everything at my disposal when I make these predictions in the first place. So I wonder whether is there anything happening in that space?
Sorry. I think that's really true. So once we stop just judging the importance of our work by the results, by whether the results are significant or not or whatever, then it puts a greater burden on judging what's an interesting question. We don't really have very good criteria for that.
What's a well-informed question? What's a well-informed question? It assumes that there's a big black box there, which is us, as if we've got perfect questions every single time. We're not well-informed half the time.
Yeah. So again, it's sort of moving out of away from the logic of justification, which is where all of our efforts have been, to kind of talking about discovery and what's worthwhile, what's interesting, what's novel, what's surprising, and that's hard from where we are because so many of our hypotheses are statistical hypotheses, not substantive hypotheses, or not sufficiently connected to theory.
Any other panel members? Pascal?
Yeah, the question regarding the p-hacking and the extra collection of data. So often when you kind of, let's say, do a power analysis, it's obviously based on the effect size that is out there, but you kind of know that because of publication bias and draw a file that often these kind of effect sizes might be inflated, for example, that are in the literature. Another problem is that effect sizes can, for example, change over time, right? But if you think about something like racism, it changes, and a lot of the things that we study in psychology, these phenomena, they kind of change a lot over time. So the actual effect size in the population might be totally different over different time periods. So when you kind of do this power analysis, and then you kind of reach a certain amount of people that you're going to test, let's say 50, for example, and then you kind of test these 50 people, you look at the results, and then you find out that the effect size is not as big as you kind of expect, and the p-value is around 0.05 kind of area. Yeah? So you're not necessarily sure if it's an effect or not, or at least not a significant effect or not a significant effect. I mean, would it be then that you should just say, oh, we stop data collection? Because to me it seems then that, for example, testing extra people, because you kind of have a lower effect size, would give kind of much more valuable information than just kind of stop data collection there. Because then you get a truer, I guess, closer thing to the actual effect size.
Yeah, so I think I can actually do this one because my PhD is on power analysis, basically. So I think your right in that the estimate of the entire group with the extra people will be a more accurate estimate. But adding an extra 50 people and then testing it as if you still had a constrained type 1 error rate, so you still had an alpha of 0.05, isn't possible anymore. You've expanded, you've spent your ability to keep your error rate at that point. Which is not necessarily a bad thing. Again, saying if you wrote in a paper, oh yeah, and then we tested another 50 people, and this is our estimate, people will still have a more accurate idea of what the actual result is. But you shouldn't trust your p-value if you've done that. It's fine. I mean, it depends what your goal is. Yeah. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, because we kind of aligned in saying that we're just being upfront, basically, I initially tested 50 people, but then I kind of keep testing more people. But it also kind of fundamentally assumes that this kind of supposed effect size is kind of known in advance, especially when exploratory research is not known in advance, but also the effect size, even if it's well-known research, might have changed or might be inflated. So, you know, like knowing the actual effect size is so difficult.
Completely possible. Yeah, no, so I think the only really rigorous theoretically motivated way of planning effect sizes planning a study using power analysis is fundamentally to use the minimum effect size of interest. But often in psychology research, we're interested in effects that, like things that, if there's any effect that's interesting. If we're studying ESP, like an effect of 0.002 to infinity 1 is actually pretty bloody interesting because it turns out the world works in a completely different way than we thought about it. In most cases, the minimum effect size that we're interested in is somewhat larger than that. Most things we wouldn't care if it's almost 0, and we can plan for that, but it still might be too expensive. So we have to balance these things out. Again, it really depends on what your goal is. Sometimes the kind of model of statistical significance testing is not the right model. And there are also things you can do, like you can plan to have multiple tests. So you can have basically have an alpha of like 0.2 something at the beginning, 0.02 something beginning, and you can it's called sequential testing, and it means that you can test your data multiple times and still have an alpha of 0.05.
Yes. Well, there's also one other thing you could do there. So you're trying to figure out whether it's likely to be significant or not. You run the extra 50, you run the extra 100, whatever. This is now exploratory work, and at the end of that experiment, you now have a better estimate of what you think the effect size is, and then you can put that into a power analysis and decide whether you want to run another experiment to test whether that's true. There's nothing that says you can only ever run one experiment. Now that would get a bit expensive, but that would be rigorous, and then we'll be fine with that.
Again, none of this is a problem if you're upfront about it. The problem is that we do this and tell people that we do this, or that we'll do it and then it'll be really embarrassing.
I'd really like to hear some questions or comments in general from students, and so to give you a moment to think about what that question or comment might be, I'm going to ask a question at the panel, which is asking you to practice a little bit of empathy for each of your suggested solutions. What do you think would be something that someone who is maybe a little resistant to using that strategy would say to using that strategy, and maybe what you would say back to them? So Fiona, do you want to start?
Definitely. So with the 21 word thing, I reckon a common objection is the word limit. So I today make an offer that if you find yourself in this position where you cannot fit in 21 words, please send me your manuscript. I will personally edit it to illustrate whether a 21 words guaranteed.
That was empathetic.
Felix, do you have...
What's a common... I tried to do this in the thing, and that was all that. I think... Has anyone got a common objection? What's the common objection?
Or, I mean, does anyone from the audience? I mean, like, I didn't...
What if you get scooped?
You're up against the VA, they've got $40 million of funding, you can't get an NHMRC, you pre-registered your thing, they come and go, wow, great.
So there's literally a, you can embargo your pre-registration if you're really that worried. Like you're like, if someone else finds out about this idea, are they going to steal it immediately? You can embargo it so that it will automatically come out in 3 months or whatever after you have enough time to do the experiment. You still can't change it. This is on the open science framework. You can do that, and that totally allows that issue. Also, I mean, obviously you're not actually making this argument, but yeah, you're probably not going to worry about being screwed.
Yeah, I think if you are, if you're in a position where you can write a full pre-registration, like your experiment is probably starting next week. So the chances of someone
Like getting
finding it and doing it before you and publishing just seems very remote to me.
I disagree with that because my ideas are so brilliant.
Embargo away.
I should also clarify that it needn't necessarily be objections, right? I mean, for example, I didn't pre-register my last study, and frankly, it was because I was lazy and didn't think to do it, So it needn't necessarily be strong objections, but more these kinds of, oh, I don't have the time, and, those kinds of issues, which I think are very common.
I would chuck a question for pre-registration, because this I've happened. So the person pre-registers the study. It's a good, it's all good. It isn't very stupid, as you put it. And it works out. It goes through reviews. And then one of the reviewers, it's usually reviewer 2 for some reason. I think they should re-register the reviewer numbers. Towards reviewer 2. Reviewer 2 comes and, of course, wants additional analyses to be done, which is fine, but it's really to satisfy reviewers 2 personal curiosity. And there's really nothing to do with the study, but you're going to do it anyway because you want to get published. Now you've got a problem, because you are saying, I pre-registered the study, I've done this proper analysis, and now I'm doing this extra analysis, which wasn't in my pre-registration, which is going to make me look bad.
So I think there's an extra thing came in at the end there. Why is that going to make me look bad?
Because I'm now doing analyses that I have not pre-registered.
So in almost every single pre-registered study that has been published, there are statistical tests that have not been pre-registered. And that's not a problem. You just say it. Like, again, this is not like some puritanical, like, only do what's in the pre-registration application. Like, it's just a matter of being upfront about it. So you say, you can say, do a review of suggestions. You can get away with that. Or say, additional exploratory analyses show. Yes. Like this, you can do it in 1 or 2 words, basically. It's not a real concept. Every single one that
we have a database of all of the articles in psychology that have a pre-registration badge. So, and Felix,
if you want to do some analysis on it.
Piers, I'd like you to practice some empathy now.
Very hard. Look, the problem with replications is that it's hard to get them published in top-notch journals, because top-notch journals don't like to do that. And I can understand why people wouldn't want to do that, especially at the beginning of their career. They're trying to get out those first few papers. So, yeah, I can understand why people don't want to do it. I would suggest, though, that strategically, even if you're starting on PhD students, it's a very good idea to do replication, because it's a real waste of your time to do that advanced study and then find what you built upon doesn't actually work. I wish the field was a little bit more receptive to replications, and I could see ways it could be altered to make it much more receptive. Happy to talk about that if you're interested in that.
Yeah, I'd like us to take another question.
I had a general question for everyone regarding the extent to which a lot of these ideas are relevant to modeling types of papers, where you take on a sort of iterative approach, where you change things many times until you get the model to start working. How much of the detail you suggest should be documented throughout and potentially pre-registered?
what even are the questionable research practices for things that aren't hypothesis testing? So for model building or, you know, that sort of thing. And it's a bit of an underexplored area at the moment.
Hopefully at least we'll have a paper on it remarkably soon. Yeah.
So I can say a few things about that. For my PhD, I basically just did modeling. And we had a wonderful term, which is quite common nowadays, for people who can get their model to predict phenomena after they've occurred, postdictions. Look, realistically, you are going to be doing postdictions a lot of the time because you developed the model to explain a certain set of data. I think the best thing you can do and the most honest thing you can do is to not cherry pick which phenomena you're going to try and model and explain, but to do all of them in a set area and state in advance. Our purpose was to find a model which could explain, I don't know, all of likeness perception, and then somehow systematically go through and say the key, then you can't isolate everything, there's too much, but to somehow choose in advance, and maybe you can pre-register in advance before you start with the model. That doesn't quite make sense. But you systematically indicate which ones you're going to actually model, and you model those. To me, it's awfully suspicious when every phenomenon that a model tackles, it can actually simulate. Obviously, it's been cherry-picked, but I don't even really know what the term cherry-picking means in that case.
Some combination,
Yes.
bias, and
Yes.
cherry-picking. I mean, one thing that might, it depends on the context, but probably things like what are the actual decision criteria you're going to be using to distinguish between, to judge a model when that's self-done, and things like that are probably the place where these kinds of pre-registration things make more sense. But it's kind of an open area.
One thing you can do is you can make your code for the model available in a very easy-to-use fashion so people can then try and apply it to other phenomena and rapidly discover what the limitations are. What does technology like to do that?
A question here and then one here.
Thank you. So I just want to go back to the topic of replication, if that's okay. I found it interesting because there were two ideas that were said about it. So one is that, you know, the field is not that keen on replication, right? And we are the field. So, you know what I mean? Like the field is not some kind of thing that has an existence in itself. It's just basically the people working on it. And the same idea with journals are not that keen on replication. It's like these journals are not being edited by themselves. Like there are a bunch of very senior academics editing these journals, and you know, very powerful academics making those decisions. So, from my point of view, it's a problem of poor science management, what we're seeing here. So I just want to hear what you guys have to say about that.
Okay, so these editors, they're much malign creatures. They actually, almost to a person, everyone I've met has really taken a job basis and had the interest of the field at the heart. But they have competing constraints. They're trying to do the best for the field, but they don't want to tank their journal. For journals, impact factors, so as researchers we have citation rates, but for journals the equivalent is the impact factor. And those are very important. And as an editor, it's not going to be so good after your 3-year term to say, look, I really helped the field and I published all these great articles. Yeah, but I halved my journal's impact factor, but you know that's okay. I did some good work. And so when they make decisions, they do have to keep this in mind. And replication studies tend not to be cited as well as original studies.
I have explicitly heard journal editors say that they think that publishing replications would not have impacted and therefore breach their contract with wireless primarily.
Yes. So what I think it's not just them and not just us. There's actually rules about what constitutes an impact factor. One way to get around this would be, so an impact factor is the total number of citations a journal has in a set period divided by the total number of citable articles. Total number of citable articles is not all the articles in the journal. Certain types of articles are excluded, such as editorials. If we as a field could agree that direct replications, which appear only in online forms, count towards the citations. So journals journals would adopt the Pottery Bible. If you publish an article, you have to accept any direct replications of that article, but only in online form. So there's direct replication, not going off anywhere, just a simple direct replication. They count towards the citations, like the citations of editorials count, but they are not on the denominator. They're not accountable article. So like editorials can only increase a journal's impact factor, then all direct replications could only increase a replication factor. Now, impact factor. Now, I don't think they're going to increase it much, but I think it's a very big ask to ask an editor to do something which will lower his impact factor, as opposed to do something which can't lower his impact factor, might possibly increase it slightly, but probably by not much, but would help the field a great deal. Then I think you would get buy-in from the editors.
Because we're needing to wrap up, I'm sorry, I know there are follow-up questions, but just one final question from Reb before we break for drinks.
First, I was going to ask if you've seen good examples of how to apply or adapt some of these practices to field research, where you may not know in advance how many participants you're going to get because organizations collecting data for you, or because it's a rare opportunity to collect data from a certain sample, there's more temptation to include multiple measures that may or may not be central to your primary hypotheses. Like, obviously, a lot of them could be applied, but I just wonder if you've seen examples of taking these out of fairly controlled studies to messier environments.
Pre-register it.
No, I really think that you just pre-register what you're going to do, and then if things change, they change, and you acknowledge it. This is again, you can there's a lot of information that you can pre-register, and you just pre-register the information that you have as best you can, and there's still a great deal of benefit in that. And I think that the main benefit you get from pre-registration is not like having this thing out there. It doesn't make your stats better or something. What it means is you, as the individual researcher, know what you have changed since you began with the thing. And if you realize that you've changed all the tests you're doing, yeah, this is definitely an exploratory line. That's a really important thing to know.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there, unfortunately. But just a final plug that this is our website for the Colloquium series. The recording for this will be available, but also our panel members have really kindly made available various resources that they use along these lines. So, for example, Felix has provided a repository of different ways to pre-register studies and things, and so those will be available online for the people here, but also people who couldn't make it in person. And of course, if you have anything that hasn't been mentioned today that you'd like to share and make available, please send it to me and let me know, and we can make that available. But for now, I'd just really like to finish by inviting you all to come and have a drink, and also to thank our very long-suffering panel members.